Well, good afternoon, Parkview friends. I really do miss seeing you, and I'm just going to have to do like an air hug or a virtual elbow bump or whatever, but I'm grateful that we can be together for this time in the Word, and we're going to continue our series on Joseph. We've taken a little bit of a break because of the extenuating circumstances and the extraordinary season in which we're in. But I think Joseph's life always has some timeless messages for us. And so today, we're going to talk about how to handle success successfully. And you might think that sounds a little bit opposite of the season that we're going in, but you'll be surprised at how much this relates. Thomas Carlyle, the British author, wrote, "Adversity is hard on a person. But for every 1,000 people who can withstand adversity, there's only one who can withstand prosperity." And the Bible is full of examples of people who did all right when they're having difficulty, but they crumbled spiritually when they experienced prosperity. Saul, David, Solomon, all of them had major failures in the midst of success and when things were going good. Our modern world also has noteworthy examples of people who could take adversity, but they fell in the time of prosperity. Richard Nixon, Jimmy Swaggart, Elvis Presley. See, prosperity seems to bring a subtle seduction that can erode character and corrupt values. Charles Swindoll writes, "A time to be careful is when one reaches his goals. The easiest period in a crisis is actually the battle itself. The most difficult period is the period of indecision, whether to fight or run away. And the most dangerous period is the aftermath. It is then, with all his resources spent and his guard down, that an individual must watch out for dull reactions and faulty judgment. In other words, vulnerability accompanies achievement." And the fact is that very few people can handle success successfully, but Joseph did. He serves as a classic example of how to handle fame and wealth and power. So let's take a look at how Joseph achieved instant prosperity and yet maintained his walk with God. C.S. Lewis said, "Prosperity is good campaigning weather for the devil." And the story of Joseph's promotion to power is a good demonstration of how quickly God can reverse a situation. So a little background. Joseph had been in prison. He'd correctly interpreted 2 dreams, one for the cupbearer and one for the baker. And those dreams were fulfilled exactly. The baker was hanged, and the cupbearer was restored to his position. And Joseph had said to the cupbearer, "Remember me." Joseph tried to arrange his own release from that prison, but the cupbearer forgot Joseph for 2 years. And in those 2 years, Joseph learned dependence on God. He learned that God was all he needed because God was all he had. I heard of one university student who was about to take a 2-hour final exam in chemistry. And on her way to the final, she encountered a campus chaplain. And she immediately stopped and said to the chaplain, "Will you pray for me at 4 p.m. today?" And the chaplain said, "Well, of course, but why do you want me to wait until then?" She said, "Well, my 2-hour chemistry exam begins at 3, and I'd like to see if I can do it on my own first." See, that's a parable of what a lot of us try to do. We try to do it ourselves first. Joseph tried it, and his failure to secure his own release, he was forced to depend on God to rescue him. So this is where the story picks up in Genesis chapter 41, verses 1 through 8. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. And in the morning his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. See, Pharaoh knew that these dreams meant something important, but he didn't know what. So he turned to all the wise men and magicians in Egypt. This sort of thing was right in their wheelhouse, and I presume that some of them probably said, well, here's what it means, and gave their interpretation, but their explanation didn't satisfy, it didn't resonate with Pharaoh. And then all of a sudden, the cupbearer had his memory jogged. In verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Now, I think right there is a clue as to why the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. He had already been in trouble once and got put behind bars for it. And so after that experience, he's going to be very careful to watch every word that he said because he didn't want to wind up in prison again. And so while the text in Genesis 40, verse 23 says the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph, I would call that a case of selective memory retention. Now, anyone who's ever had children immediately has experienced this phenomenon of selective memory retention. My kids growing up, they had perfect memories when it came to a promise that I'd made, but their memories lagged a little bit when it came to doing daily chores. So the cupbearer in verses 10 to 13 of Genesis 41 says, 2 years ago, when I was in prison, there was a Hebrew there named Joseph, who interpreted a troubling dream for me, and it came true exactly as he predicted. And so in verse 14, Pharaoh gave orders for Joseph to be brought from the prison to the palace. And see, the turning point in Joseph's life came on a day just like any other day in the dungeon. There was no promise of relief, no advance warning. That morning dawned like any other morning. But suddenly the warden said, you've been asked by Pharaoh to come to the palace and interpret a dream. Genesis 41, verse 14. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Now, you know what that verse tells me? Well, it says to me that God doesn't like mustaches and beards. Just kidding. What it tells me is that after 2 years in prison, Joseph looked awful and smelled worse. Verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So picture this scene. Joseph is 30 years old by now. He's been a slave and then a prisoner, and all of a sudden, out of clear blue, he's standing in the opulence and power of Pharaoh's palace. Surrounding Pharaoh are all his counselors who no doubt have a condescending attitude and are hoping Joseph will fail, that he won't be able to interpret the dreams either. And I think it's interesting what Joseph did not say. He didn't say, Pharaoh, before I tell you what your dream means, I want to say a word about your lousy cupbearer. That guy has a terrible memory, and if he had one bit of gratitude, I would have been in prison for 2 years. What's up with that? If you're trusting your life to him, you're trusting your life to a slacker. And it would have been easy for Joseph to take advantage of the situation to voice some resentment against the cupbearer. Why not? It's his day in court. But none of that is seen in Joseph's response. And what is striking to me about Joseph is the lack of any anger whatsoever. In fact, in the balance of his life from the age of 30 to 110, no words of resentment are recorded from his lips. Not against his brothers who sold him into slavery, not against Potiphar's wife who falsely accused him of attempted sexual assault, not against Potiphar who believed her lies, or against the cupbearer. Joseph is as pure-hearted a person as they come. And he also didn't say to Pharaoh, well, I've been known to unravel a few dreams in my day. Lay it on me. This is what he said in verse 16. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he needs. See, Joseph doesn't promote himself. He could have. He's in a prime position to do that. But Joseph gave God the credit. And so Pharaoh in verses 17 through 24 relates to Joseph his two dreams. And Pharaoh was afraid that Joseph wasn't going to be able to interpret them. After relating the two dreams, he added, I've told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. When Pharaoh had finished talking, Joseph calmly said, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. He started right in, and as soon as Pharaoh heard him speak, he knew that Joseph was onto something. Joseph spoke with authority because his authority came from God. He said, Pharaoh, both dreams mean the same thing. There is going to be 7 fat years of abundance, followed by 7 lean years of famine. And whatever you store up during the years of prosperity will be devoured in the severe famine that follows. The famine will be so bad that no one will remember the good old days. Verse 32. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it. Now, in other words, when God declares his will, he provides confirmation. The Spirit's witness is not given in isolation. There are two dreams that provided a perfect unity and mutual confirmation. R.T. Kendall says this: the doubling of the dream was tantamount to what's called the promise and the oath. What's the difference between a promise and an oath? Well, a promise in the Bible is always a conditional thing. A promise will be kept if certain conditions are met. But what about an oath? See, an oath is unconditional. It will be done no matter what. There are no conditions attached to an oath because it's so. It will happen. Once the oath is disclosed, that's it. And so Joseph was very specific. Anybody can know within a year whether Joseph had really got it right or not. And he would look like a fool if prosperity did not emerge in a short time. It means Joseph had got it wrong and back to prison he'd go. But when Joseph saw this double confirmation, it gave him all the boldness and confidence in the world. The reason he could speak with authority and certainty was not that he was arrogant and proud. It was simply because he knew something of the ways of God. And he had no fear of being contradicted. Joseph knew that God wouldn't have given the dream twice if there's any doubt about the outcome. But Joseph wasn't finished. He not only made an interpretation, he went on to make a recommendation. Verse 33. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Joseph put himself on the line here, not merely by interpreting the dream, but then by giving him some unsolicited advice to Pharaoh. The years of prosperity would be so abundant that people wouldn't miss the surplus. So Joseph gave this sensible advice. Now, not only would the people then have food during the famine, but all that would make Pharaoh a very rich man indeed. For he alone would have food, and the word would get out to the rest of the world that Egypt had plenty to eat. Everyone would come to Pharaoh to buy grain. So Joseph showed Pharaoh how he could make a lot of money. Now, without this application, there'd be no purpose and no value to the dream. See, it wasn't merely enough to know what the future was. The question was, what are you going to do about it? And we know that Pharaoh had been upset because he hadn't been able to get the dream interpreted. He had sleepless nights over it and wanted more than anything in the world to have it explained. And so Pharaoh could have stopped Joseph right there and said, hey, look here, you've explained it. Thanks, that's enough. You solved the problem, now go on your way. He could have said to his servants, give this man a reward and let him be free. I now have this dream off my chest. I knew there was a riddle to this. I just needed to know what it was. But Pharaoh needed more than just the interpretation of the dream. He needed to be told what to do. And so Joseph told him. It's important that the Bible says, but the point is to live it. See, that's the deal. It's not just enough to know the Bible, but to integrate it into our lives. And if Joseph had put himself on the line with a specific prediction, which was subject to verification, and then he recommended a course of action, but Pharaoh also put himself on the line. He had rejected the experts, but as soon as he heard Joseph, Pharaoh said, that's it. Verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. And in a very short time, in a matter of months, everyone would know whether Pharaoh had made a fool of himself in taking the counsel of a Hebrew slave. Now imagine Pharaoh taking a man like that seriously. Anybody might say to the king, do you realize what you're doing here? Do you realize who you're listening to? This man is a foreigner. He's a slave. We don't know anything about his background. He's an accused rapist. Are you really going to listen to him and take him seriously? That's exactly what Pharaoh had to face when he listened to Joseph and took his counsel. Pharaoh had a lot to lose. His reputation was at stake. But Pharaoh didn't wait for verification. He believed Joseph and he acted on that belief. Verse 38, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this one man in whom is the Spirit of God? Joseph's interpretation and application were so simple and self-authenticating. The two dreams made no sense until Joseph spoke. But when he gave the interpretation, the whole matter is so obvious. Pharaoh was wondering, how could we have missed it? It was so clear. It's so obvious to Pharaoh that he said to his officials, can we find anyone like this in whom the divine Spirit lives? See, Pharaoh knew that he wasn't dealing with just any ordinary Joe Dokes. And I think it's likely that Pharaoh probably checked on Joseph's references. He went to the warden and said, what kind of prisoner is Joseph? And the warden said, well, he's a model prisoner. I put the entire prison in his care and I didn't have to worry about a thing. I think Pharaoh probably went to his chief of the guard, captain of the guard, Potiphar. Why did you throw him in prison? Well, there may have been a misunderstanding. I don't know if he's guilty or not, but he was absolutely the best slave I ever had. He was a terrific administrator. And so to Joseph's utter astonishment, Pharaoh offers him the job. Verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, and there's no one so discerning and wise as you, you shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. See, all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, Joseph becomes the number 2 man in Egypt. Literally in prison one day and palace the next. You talk about a rags to riches story. This is it. Jesus said in Luke 14, verse 11, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. In other words, exaltation is right, provided we do it the right way. And the ultimate exaltation awaits us in heaven. Before the crown, though, is the cross. And I believe it's dangerous to get into a position of leadership before we're ready. It all began when Joseph gave a promise to God gave a promise to Joseph through a dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. And Joseph's mistake wasn't in receiving the dream, but it was probably in telling it to his 11 brothers. It didn't take a whole lot of brain power to figure out the interpretation of that. The brothers got the message, and surprise, they didn't like it. So what Joseph didn't know was his exaltation was a long ways off on the timeline. It's now 13 years later. God has been at work. Joseph's experience with slavery and being put in prison had prepared him for this moment. God had been humbling him and forging his character for just this time. Between the years 1873 and 1978, more than 100 years, 13 attempts to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a balloon had been made, and all of them had failed. And when Michael Anderson finally succeeded, it was only after he had failed the first time. And he said, success in any venture is just the intelligent application of failure. See, God allows us to fail, to go through times of slavery and imprisonment, to develop character in us. Having the character of Christ is more important to God than what we do or don't do for him. God wants to exalt us, but not at the cost of our character. And when we're broken, when we humble ourselves, or are humbled by God, which is always more painful, let me assure you, that's when God can trust us. Joseph is only 30 years old when he's made prime minister of Egypt. Imagine the pride he would have had if he hadn't had that experience of slavery and prison. If I had been promoted to prime minister of Egypt at the age of 30, I would be insufferably proud. And so would Joseph. But Joseph knew that God had been behind all that had happened. And now he's standing before Pharaoh. How could he have arranged any of that? Glenn Martin, in his book Beyond the Rat Race, reports on one business executive who was explaining to an interviewer. He said, I found the road to success no easy matter. I started at the bottom. I worked 14 hours a day. I sweated. I fought. I maneuvered. I schemed. I took abuse. I did things that others might not approve of. I kept on climbing the ladder. And the interviewer said, and now you're a success? The business executive said, no, I wouldn't say that. Just quote me as saying that I've become an expert at climbing ladders. Patrick Morley says this, most men then start chasing the good life with clear thinking and pure motives. Our goal is to improve the standard of living for our family. The task is a means to an end, but we get so involved in the task, and it can be exciting, we lose sight of why we're working so hard. We become confused, and what originally was a means to an end becomes an end in itself. One businessman said, after climbing the corporate and social ladder, I told my wife, we've arrived. And my wife said, yes, but at the wrong place. And Patrick Morley says this, he says, my wife and I reviewed our calendar and a stack of time-consuming opportunities, and the thought came, why not prioritize everything we do on the basis of who's going to be crying at our funeral? And so we did that, and the results, he said, saved our family. See, the simple question, who's going to be crying at our funeral, cut through the time wasters with the accuracy of a laser beam. Prioritizing this way kept us focused on our biblical priorities. Genesis 41, verse 41. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. The whole land. Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and is under his control at the age of 30. He had tremendous authority, but remember, he had been given authority in smaller spheres before this, in Potiphar's house and then the prison. He'd been faithful. And Jesus said, if you're faithful in little things, I'll make you ruler over much. It took Joseph 30 years to become an overnight success. And Joseph was faithful behind the scenes in the little tasks. When this key position of authority came, he was ready. Genesis 41, verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. Now that signet ring was like Pharaoh's signature. He would use that ring to stamp the seal, the soft clay, and this would be to say, this belongs to the king. This was Joseph receiving Pharaoh's American Express card. With no limit on the line of credit, Joseph was instantly a wealthy man. This gave him access to all the riches of Egypt, and he could make whatever transaction he wanted. Verse 42 continues, he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now Joseph has lost 2 coats previously, but now God gives him a coat of royalty. Joseph wore a chain of shackles on his journey to Egypt as a slave, and again he wore chains in prison, but now he has a gold chain around his neck. The gold is the necklace of aristocracy. Verse 43, he had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and the men shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And so at the age of 30, Joseph was a highly visible national celebrity. He had clout. People probably asked him for his autograph, and they would whisper, there he goes. And he would see people pointing at him. It's all pretty heady stuff. Verse 44. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt. Joseph had more power than the president, Congress, and Supreme Court combined. It's quite a far cry from prison, but the principle remains the same. No cross, no crown. Verse 45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphaneth-Paneah. And that name is significant. It means revealer of secrets, or God speaks through him. His gift, which his brothers despised and the cupbearer ignored, is now publicly acknowledged and recognized. Oswald Sanders has said, not every person can carry a full cup. Joseph's cup is now full. And prosperity has its pitfalls. If you were asked, why can't more people handle success? What happens to people? What would you say? Well, personally, my number one answer would be probably pride. And pride can come on instantly, or it can happen gradually. But pride, at the end of the day, is to live independently from God. And when people experience prosperity, there can be a temptation for those not to think that they don't feel a need for God any longer. Some people who achieve status and wealth can be tempted to feel superior, and an arrogant spirit can develop. 1 Timothy 3:6 says that pride can be a snare for those in a position of spiritual leadership. Pete Rose was the star baseball player of the world champion Cincinnati Reds. And he is in the baseball record books of having more hits in history than anyone else. Pete Rose has more hits than anybody in the history of baseball. But he is not in the Baseball Hall of Fame because he also has serious gambling addiction. And he bet on his own team even, which is a big no-no in sports. On one occasion, he said he didn't have to pay his gambling debts because he said, "I'm Pete Rose and I don't have to pay anybody." Solomon said that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Pride means that we take the credit for our success. I heard the story of a half-drunk congressman who once staggered up to the author Horace Greeley. And this congressman said, "I'm a self-made man." And Horace Greeley replied that he was glad to hear it. He said, "That relieves God of a great responsibility." My brother-in-law plays in the Beach Boys. He's been with the Beach Boys since 1982, and he's a follower of Christ. He's never taken drugs or done alcohol in his life. But he's also a studio musician. He's performed with everybody that you can think of. But he said one of his favorite stories has to do with Eric Clapton. Now, Eric Clapton was a member of this supergroup in the 60s called Cream. Cream because they were the cream of the crop when they got together. Eric Clapton was acknowledged as the world's best guitar player. Ginger Baker was acknowledged as the world's best drummer. And then the lead vocalist, who was also a bass player, was Jack Bruce. And that's not an easy thing to accomplish, to sing lead vocals and play bass. And Cream was an amazing group. And so after they disbanded and they made their millions of dollars, I think it's in the first thousands, they were going to have one concert for a reunion concert at Madison Square Garden. And so they got together to discuss the terms. And so Eric Clapton walks in, and Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker are already sitting at the table. And Jack Bruce said, I want 33% of the gate, because Eric Clapton's the big name. And Eric Clapton said, "You're not getting 33% of the gate. You're getting," and he goes, I want 33% of the gate. I demand it. And Eric Clapton said, "You're not getting 33% of the gate, Jack. You're getting 50% of the gate." So Ginger Baker said, "Well, what am I getting?" And Eric said, "Well, you're getting 50% of the gate." And they said, "Well, what about you?" And Eric Clapton said, "I get the pleasure of performing with my friends again." So he didn't need it. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the notoriety. Eric Clapton didn't let fame and prosperity go to his head. But see, we all know people who are self-made men who worship their Creator. God had driven the pride out of Joseph. As a slave and then in prison, Joseph was faithful and he was trustworthy. He wasn't full of himself. And I think another pitfall of prosperity can be false security, because we can end up putting our trust in wealth instead of God. It can lead to laziness, or it can be even worse is greed. Or perhaps some people struggle with guilt for being prosperous. These people find that accepting their lot in life is difficult. Satan poisons their spirit from experiencing joy and gratitude. It's important to realize that God is at the root of blessing us. Instead of feeling guilt over abundance, find God's purpose in it. But I think perhaps the most common pitfall to success and prosperity is simply distraction. When things go well in your life, we can get so busy that we don't have time for God, for church, or for spiritual things. We don't mean it to be that way, but we're easily distracted. In the book of Revelation, the church at Laodicea was lukewarm. Why? Because it was rich. And prosperity can get our focus off Christ and make us dull and apathetic spiritually. But notice how Joseph handled success. First, he accepted the position willingly. When Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I want you to be prime minister," he didn't refuse it. He didn't make an apology. He didn't say, "Well, I'm only 30 years old, I'm a foreigner, and I've been a prisoner. I don't think I'm worthy." He didn't take the Eeyore approach. See, don't confuse humility with insecurity. Humility is finding out what God has given you and then using it according to His purposes, for His glory, not your own. Joseph accepted the position and immediately went to work. Now notice he didn't refuse to wear the king's robe or the necklace, or drive the king's chariot, or use the king's ring. If power had gone to his head, that could be a different matter. But Joseph knew how to handle success successfully. And here's the key. Joseph knew that God had put him in that position for a reason. Proverbs 29, verse 2. When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. Joseph knew that if an evil person had been made prime minister of Egypt, he would rake in the extra grain and the people would starve. Joseph accepted the position not for his own reward, but to save the nation. Psalm 75, verse 7 says, God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. And it is obvious that God is exalting Joseph here. Not only that, God even provided for him on another level, something Joseph probably had never dreamed could happen. God gave Joseph a wife in Egypt. In verses 50 to 52 in Genesis 41 further describe God's blessing Joseph. He had 2 sons before this famine hit. The first was named Manasseh, which means God has made me forget all my trouble. And Joseph's second son was named Ephraim, because that means God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And every time he called out the name of his children, Joseph was giving God thanks. God has made me forget. God has made me fruitful. And every time someone asked him his kids' names, he would explain the meaning and give God the glory. And the second thing that Joseph did was he performed his job with diligence. Genesis 41, verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. And see, don't miss this part. When God blesses you, he does it for a reason. Don't miss the purpose behind God's blessing. He has blessed you, and he's blessed me, so that we'd be a blessing to others. Don't use it to increase your own lifestyle. Enjoy your prosperity and multiply the work of God. That's the bottom line. Don't lose the gift of God. Please him with it. Prosperity is from God, but it's not for you. It's a means to another end, the purposes of God. God doesn't want you to feel guilty. He doesn't want you to feel prideful and take credit for it. Just be grateful and do the work of God. Please God with our prosperity. And that's what Joseph did. So, here's the takeaway. First of all, God's heart is to bless you. Secondly, your character is more important to God than success. For example, I think of Noah. He preached for 120 years, had 0 converts, but he saved the human race because he was faithful. So, your character is important to God. Number 3, be grateful for prosperity. It's the antidote to pride. And number 4, you're blessed to be a blessing. Don't miss the purpose of God by keeping success and prosperity to yourself. And so those are good words in this season that we're in as a nation and as a community. So let's close with prayer. God, I thank you for your word. And I pray that we would live lives humbly and give you the glory. That we can be gratitude for your goodness to us, and that we can continue to trust you during this time. In Christ's name, amen.